Lorri, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Carla. I appreciate the invitation.
The work that you've done around autism and insurance reform is just outstanding, along with so many other things that you've done. Ryan's Law in 2007, the decade that you spent on autism insurance reform of impacting change in all 50 states, and now your work with CASP, not to mention starting the Unumb Center. Also, your work with Autism Summit was another big thing. So many things, Lorri, that you've done that I just have such a tremendous amount of respect for. I feel like our field has grown because of autism insurance reform, and you had a very big impact on that. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you. What an introduction. That was overly kind, but thank you.
So I think I'd like to start really with thinking about all the things that you have accomplished. How were you able to balance being a mom, being an advocate for a child, your own child, be an advocate for your family and families across the U.S.? How did you balance it all?
I didn't. Not well is the answer. It's a constant struggle being a mom. I have three boys, and two of them are actually diagnosed on the spectrum. My oldest, Ryan, that many people know, who is very severely impaired. He's nonverbal. He's aggressive at times. So, he's that end of the spectrum. And then my youngest is the polar opposite end of the spectrum. So we live that entire spectrum at the dinner table every night. But I feel like I mess up all the time. Like there are things I could do better professionally. There are things I could do better personally as their mom. But I just keep plugging away and do the best that I can do. And I really share my work with my children a lot. We talk about it at the dinner table. I take them to conferences with me whenever I can, so they understand why mom is away sometimes, and they're invested in the mission. They're very much a part of it. It wasn't always well balanced, but I just gave myself a little grace and involved them in the mission. Dan, my husband, is part of it professionally now. For the longest time, I was doing this work to pass autism insurance legislation in state after state after state. It's one thing to get a law on the books, and it's an entirely different matter for it to work perfectly and to benefit the families that it was meant to benefit. Dan and I are both lawyers. I would involve Dan, and I needed his assistance to make the laws unfurl properly. And finally, he was doing so much of it. I'm just like, why don't you just come over and do this for a living as well? So he left his law practice and now runs the Autism Legal Resource Center, which is a law firm dedicated entirely to autism and to the issues our families and our providers face. When I wrote Ryan's Law, the bill that became known as Ryan's Law, that was 2005 when I sat down at my kitchen table and just scratched out what I thought the law should be. I was just thinking about solving the issue in South Carolina where we lived, because I knew I would go to support groups and I'd meet these other parents. And it just broke my heart knowing that they didn't have access to good quality ABA. And there was nothing they could do to get access because they weren't wealthy families and insurance wouldn't pay for it. And, the school district would kind of say, we'll give you some ABA, but they give you an hour or two a week with a BCBA who live 3 states away. So right. It wasn't real, and it wasn't going to produce any result. And I knew that, but I didn't even want to say it to those families because I was like, what good does it do them to know that? It's like a knife in your stomach to know there's something out there that would help so much, but you can't get it because you're not rich. And so really, I wrote the bill just thinking about those moms and dads and thinking, we got to fix this. This makes no sense that health insurance will not pay for the intervention that we know could change the trajectory of these children's lives. That makes no sense. It just became such a huge movement that it turned into a national movement and has increased the demand for behavior analysts in such a way that the numbers have skyrocketed, that the whole industry has built around it. Like, that was the furthest thing from my mind ever. One thing that's funny, Carla, is that even Ryan's law, the South Carolina law that requires health insurance coverage for ABA, it wasn't really about Ryan. In fact, he didn't even get benefits under Ryan's law. It's crazy that the law named for him, Ryan, doesn't get coverage under Ryan's law, because at that time we had insurance that was self-funded through my husband's law firm. And we knew that. So I was a mom on a mission, but it was not so much a mom on a mission for my child as a mom on a mission to fix the inequity that I saw in the system. I kind of had this moment where I was just thinking about how unfair it is. And I kept thinking, somebody should fix that. That's crazy. And finally, I had a God moment where I realized, wait a minute, I'm somebody. Maybe this is why I went to law school, and I'm a pretty good writer, and I have a child with autism, so I understand the problem.
What about, Lorri, any advice you'd have for mothers who are trying to navigate this autism journey? What advice would you give them?
Well, probably the same. Show yourself a little grace. It's a tough journey. It is. I would say, I am 22 years into it now. My son will be 22 this week, my firstborn. I guess I'm only 20 years into it, because for the first 2 years, I didn't know he had autism. And frankly, at that time, I didn't know what autism was. But, it gets a lot easier as you go along. I feel when he was little, life was so hard, again, because of his aggression and disruptive behavior. We couldn't go to the grocery store. We couldn't go to a restaurant. We stopped going to church. I mean, it was just, everything was too much. And through very intensive ABA intervention, we've now achieved many of those goals. He goes to church with us. We go to any restaurant we want. We've had some tough times along the way, but we just kept with it. And he works really hard. So now we can do those things. And I know from an outside perspective, an outsider looking in would not say that I have a normal life, but it feels normal to us. And it feels good. We have a good, what I would describe as a good life. Ryan is still at home with us. We're working to build a campus, a residential campus where ultimately he will live. But we're just happy together as a family. And so, to the extent you're in the phase of your autism journey as a parent where it's incredibly stressful, just keep plugging away and believing in your child's abilities, and know that it gets better with time. And I just believe, I'm such a firm believer in ABA. I hate some of the misinformation that's out there. Some of the social media discourse on ABA, I think, is so harmful, because a parent whose child is newly diagnosed, I mean, if they Google ABA, they're going to see all kinds of things that just don't represent in any way the ABA that we have known and experienced. Right. And so I feel on a mission to get out there and correct some of that misinformation and just share with parents how life-changing it is and it can be for your child. And, my son, it wasn't just when he was a toddler, throughout his teenage years, he just has continued to make more and more progress and acquire more skills that make life easier for him for the rest of his life.
Right. Part of our mission at BI is to really involve the families and understand their priorities and their families and their lifestyle, and and what goals they have. And I think it's important that families look for providers that will really give the parent a place at the table and a voice into that treatment planning process. And it's really important to us that they're an active member because you define that for your family.
It's funny, Carla, when he was younger, I had a harder time telling his ABA team what my goals were for him.
Right.
My goals were I want him to talk and I want him to not pinch me anymore or bite me anymore.
Right.
But as I've grown older and as he's grown older, it's less about wanting him to talk and it is about being happy. I just want him to be happy.
Yeah.
And he's still nonverbal. He is not one of those best outcome kids who developed his language, and he's still impaired, but he is definitely happy, and that makes me happy, and that makes our family happy. Our family dynamic is good because although he never really developed the spoken language, he's got other forms of communicating some of his very basic needs, nothing complex. But I just realized it's a lot more about, is he at peace and does he feel happy, than can he talk?
You knew early on that these things were challenges, right? The things that you identified that you wanted to help with right away. And I think as providers, we owe it to our families to help them define that happiness, right? Like, what does that look like? So through conversation, as we learn about our families, learn, what barriers there are that we can tackle together, then how do we move towards that happiness piece?
Thinking about this field and how women dominated the field of behavior analysis is, I think a lot of women in this field are going to be struggling with that work-life balance. Yeah. And I guess my hope as the head of CASP, the Council of Autism Service Providers, which is the trade association that represents all of these provider organizations, is that we work really hard to make it work. I think, as you go through raising your own children, you just become better at what you're doing. And I just want to make sure we're accommodating and treasuring the women in this field for what they bring to it.
Lorri, thank you for joining us today.